Okay, class, this is 3C in your textbook. This is the last part of our biological unit. This unit is going to look at genetics, evolutionary psychology, and our behavior. This is the first part of the reading. It is from page 94 to 102. There will be another video that you probably want to take a look at that looks at page 103 to 110. So let's begin. What is behavioral genetics? What is this section of the text going to be mainly looking at? Well, what it's trying to figure out is what really impacts our behavior. Is it more environmental based? Because I grew up in a household with a sister and two parents, is that going to create my behavior in terms of whether or not I'm going to be motivated to make certain decisions? Or am I born with certain genes that's going to motivate me to make the decisions that I'm doing? Is it because of what I inherited from my parents that have been passed down to me in the biological sense? So what is behavioral genetics specifically? Behavioral genetics is a study between our differences and the way the effects and the ways the effects and interplay of heredity and the environment. So it studies the difference between our differences and how much our hereditary, our biological makeup, impacts our environment. So genetics and inheritance. Psychologists agreed that genetics play a role in our basic makeup, including our personalities, our tendency for fears, and certain behavioral patterns. One thing you gotta start knowing is the certain components of our genetics. The first thing it starts with is a chromosome. Our chromosomes are thread-like structures consisting mostly of DNA along with genes and the way the genes are organized. Chromosomes are found in the nucleus of our cells. Every cell in the body carries a complete set of biological instructions for building the organism. We have 23 pairs of chromosomes, which consists of 46 total. 23 from your mom and 23 from your dad. The sex chromosome. The two chromosomes responsible for determining a person's biological sex are represented as either the two X chromosomes for females or an X and Y chromosome for male. From your mother, you inherit an X, okay, essentially leaving your father's contribution to determine the biological sex. So it either consists of getting another X from your father or a Y from your mother. DNA. Each chromosome consists of a long, tiny coiled chain of DNA. This DNA holds our unique genetic characteristics. Okay, you don't need to know the different composites of the DNA, okay, but you do need to know that DNA makes up your chromosomes. Genes then. Genes are a segment of the chromosome that encodes the direction for inherited physical and mental characteristics of an organism. So genes are found in your DNA, and they essentially make up who you are as a person. They can be very active, which are expressed, or they can be inactive, which I was talking about before in class, that kind of lay dormant. And unless the environment really turns on the genes, they may lay dormant within you. I might have genes that are more prone for depression because maybe my father was one that had depression and my mother was one that had depression, and I have this gene, this genetic makeup that is going to make me more prone to be depressed. However, I could live in a very positive environment with a lot of positive experiences. And since my environment never really turns that on, it could lay inactive, and I can never never get diagnosed with depression. So they can lay inactive within us. Genome is our genome are instructions that make up specifically me. So it's my genetic code or my genetic blueprint. So instructions making organisms, it's the human makeup of me. Okay, everybody has a different genome. My genome is different from my sister's genome. Okay, genotype, our genetic inheritance is broken up into two categories, kind of what I was just talking about, the genotype versus phenotype. This is something maybe you want to know the difference. The phenotype is my physical characteristics, right? And the genotype is my blueprint of what makes up me.
So why don't you look exactly like your siblings? The reason why you don't look exactly like your siblings is because there's different genes that are coming from your mom and different genes coming from your dad, right? You and your siblings probably look similar, but they're not exactly the same. This is because what you inherit from your parents is just a random shuffling of the genes. This random shuffling and variation is what Darwin viewed as the raw material for evolution. So sometimes you may look like your siblings, you may look very dominant, very close to them. Other times you may have certain traits that look very similar, and then other times you don't look anything like them. It is important to remember that you are not a replica of your parents. So you are just a variation, a shuffling of them. So how much of this science influences me? How much does our biological makeup influence our actions? Does the environment have a greater influence, or does the biological have a greater influence? This is what they're trying to uncover. One would have to set up an experiment, right, with genes, similar genes, to find out how much it really impacts us. How much of my behavior is due to the genes? How much of my behavior is really due to the environment? The only way they could really figure this out is to have another exact replica of me and kind of see how maybe their environment is impacted with the genes. So how would they do that? They'd use twins. Twin studies. Twin studies focus on the roles that heredity, your genetic makeup, and environment play in determining a trait. Twin studies of identical and fraternal twins provide a way to learn about the relative influence of nurture and nature. Let's talk about the first type of twin, a monozygote. These are identical twins. They share one egg and it splits into two. They're genetically pretty much the exact same. However, some have different numbers of a certain kind of copy of a gene. Some also may share a different placenta, but for the most part, you have the one egg right here, under identical monozygote, and you have the one egg and one sperm, and there it splits into two, and then you have two separate people from the same genetic code. And you have the dizygotic twins. These are the fraternal twins. They share two separate eggs, two different sperms. They do share similar genes, but they're not the same. Kind of like it could be like a brother or sister, essentially. What is the same is they share the same fetal environment. Identical twins, you're going to have the same sex because it's the same gene. Fraternal twins, it's what my niece and nephew are. Okay, they share entirely different sets of genes, and this is where you can get a boy and a girl. Twin facts. Often identical twins are the same in extroversion. They're outgoing or they're not outgoing. And they share the traits of neuroticism, the emotional stability. Either they're very emotionally stable or they're not. They're more similar than fraternal twins in that area. Often identical twins state that their parents and schooling environment treat them very similar, hence creating a similar environment with similar experiences. Okay, they're seen as the twins. Sometimes even teachers treat them the same way because they look very similar. When you get fraternal twins, however, they responded on the surveys that were given that parents often treat them very differently, creating two different environments and two different experiences. So how do they study this? They study this. They study the impact of your biology and your environment with twin studies. One twin study was uncovered in 1979. There was the Jim twin study, which these men, for many years, lived apart. They were adopted, and they lived in two separate environments. They didn't even know about one another. They both lived in blue-collar houses, and one brother was informed that he had a twin. And so he did some research and found out a little bit of information about his twin, and they ended up meeting. And after they met, tests were done on their heart rate, on their personality, on their different traits to see how similar they actually are, how much they show the same traits. because in the impact of how maybe they lived in two separate environments. All right, so it was 1979. Jim Springer and Jim Lewis were their names. They did a lot of tests, and they found out that personality, intelligence, heart rate, brainwave activity, physical appearance was all still the same, even though they lived in different households. After this study, many other studies were beginning to unravel where twins were separated at birth, and they found at least 80 pairs, and they found similar findings amongst the 80 pairs that they uncovered: personality, attitudes, interests, abilities, and even fears. Now, this wasn't an experiment that they tried to set up from the get-go. Let's separate these twins and see what happens. This was just something that their parents put them up for adoption, and they grew up in two separate households, and then they were able to uncover this data after this finding. Adoption studies, psychologists also study children who have been adopted to look at their relative similarities between the children and their adoptive and biological parents. So also they look at adoptive studies, and they want to figure out, are you more like your biological parents, your real parents, where you got your genes from, or are you more similar to your adoptive parents, your environment the child lives in now? And what they found, one of the most useful types of kinship studies focuses on twins, right? Children share similar traits with their biological parents versus their adoptive parents. So when they uncovered it, they found that more and more kids were like their biological parents. Heritability studies. What is this word? What is heritability, and how does it relate to individuals and groups? Using twin and adoptive studies, behavioral genetics can mathematically estimate maybe how much your heritability is due to a certain trait. Heritability is the extent to which variation among individuals can be attributed to their different genes. So how much do my genes really influence me? We can never say a percentage is inherited or what percentage is inherited. So 50% of my intelligence comes from my genes. It's just too hard to calculate. It refers to the extent to which differences among people are attributed to their genes. So Mark Twain said, hey, if we really wanted to figure this out, we would have to have the two twins living in isolated areas, not exposed to any environment, barrels essentially, and be fed, okay, and basically have limited environmental stimuli. And then once they're taken out at the age of 12, we can really see how similar, how different they are. That then we could say is mostly due to heritability because there's no environment that's they're exposed to. The more common or more similar the environment of the twins wherever they're reared, the greater we can tell that it's heritability that's causing them to be different. And the less common the environment, the lower the heritability. So heritability is how much maybe are you essentially getting from your parents or is inherited. So this all is talking about the nurture and nature debate, right? The debate over the role of biology and environment. And this is nurture versus nature. Nature, again, refers to what we're inherited. Nurture is those environmental factors. Nature supporters argue that the biological makeup primarily determines people's traits and personality. Nurture argues that it's the environment. Okay? Both views are very extreme. Most psychologists think that both nurture and nature determine your psychological traits. Gene and environment interact. You have to remember that the environment can trigger certain gene activity. I talked about how you may have a certain gene laying dormant in your body and you don't necessarily act, or your environment isn't triggering that gene to come out, so that can play a factor in your traits as well. Oftentimes genes and the scene, they say, dance together. Children also, they talked a little bit about how even though you're growing up in the same household, you have similar genes to your siblings, you may be experiencing a different environment than your sibling. Children experience parents differently, causing the parents to react differently. You know, my sister was very shy and quiet, and the way that they reacted to her was extremely different from the way that they maybe interacted with me. I was loud, outgoing. So we essentially, even though we lived in the same household, we had very different experiences with our parents. Again, one important thing to remember about genes is that it never acts alone. Genes always act in partner with the environment. The environment's going to influence your nutrition, diseases, and stress. The last little part here is the molecular genetics part. The molecular genetics study the molecular structure and function of genes. They try to determine which people are at more of a risk for certain disorders. If they can find out what specific gene causes what, then they might be able to fix us or help us, repair that gene. They seek to explain specific genes, and then they find some genes that influence different traits like addiction or obesity. So to recap, we looked at chromosomes, DNA, genes, and the genome. We talked about how they use twin studies, the difference between fraternal and identical. We talked about different research they've done on twins. We discussed heritability, and lastly, we discussed molecular genetics.